Chapter 1. The Hollow Man. The house sat at the edge of the town, cradled between the dense, whispering woods and the cracked pavement of an abandoned road. Its peeling paint and sagging porch spoke of years of neglect, its windows dark and uninviting. The townsfolk had long since stopped talking about it, except for the occasional shuddering whisper passed between children. To them, it was just the hollow house, and the warnings to stay away from it were ingrained in their childhoods, even if no one knew exactly why. Ethan drove slowly down the empty road, his car's headlights cutting through the thickening fog that rolled from the trees like a living thing. The pale glow of dusk had long since faded, leaving the sky a murky black. He hadn't meant to come this far out, but after losing his way, the roads had grown unfamiliar, the signs unreadable, swallowed by creeping vines and years of rust. When the hollow house loomed ahead, its outline barely visible through the mist, he felt an odd pull in his chest, an inexplicable compulsion to stop. He parked the car along the crumbling edge of the road, staring up at the house. It was an odd, nagging feeling, as though he had been here before, though he had never set foot in this part of town. Something about the shape of the house, the leaning chimney, the twisted iron gate hanging off its hinges, it all seemed hauntingly familiar. The air grew colder as he stepped out of the car, and a faint, metallic scent lingered in the air. Rust, decay, something else. Ethan hesitated, glancing at the dense wall of trees surrounding the property. He could swear he saw movement there, subtle shifts in the darkness, but when he blinked, it was gone. With a deep breath, he made his way toward the sagging porch, the boards creaking under his weight. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the silence, like the house was empty in more ways than one. The door, once painted a faded red, stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but an inky blackness beyond. No light from the car's headlights reached inside. His heart beat louder in his ears as he slowly pushed the door open, the rusty hinges screaming in protest. He stepped inside. The house smelled of old wood, dust, and something sour. The floor was covered in a thin layer of grime, and faint shapes of broken furniture loomed in the shadows. Moonlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting long, jagged patterns across the floor. As he stepped further into the foyer, a low hum filled the air, so faint that it could have been a trick of his mind, a vibration that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. In the corner of the room, something caught his eye, a framed portrait hanging crooked on the wall. The face in the portrait was obscured, the image worn and faded, but the figure, a tall man dressed in a dark, heavy coat, stood eerily familiar. Ethan took a step closer, his breath catching as the figure in the painting seemed to shift, just slightly, as though its head had tilted to meet his gaze. He froze, blinking, but the figure remained motionless, the image still and silent. He moved deeper into the house, drawn inexplicably toward the staircase that spiraled upward. Each step groaned under his weight as if the house were alive, aware of his presence. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched long and narrow, the doors on either side closed, their brass handles tarnished and dull. The walls here seemed to close in, the ceiling lower than it should have been, and the air grew heavier, thick with a dampness that clung to his skin. Ethan moved toward the door at the far end of the hallway. It was different from the others, smaller, older, the wood warped and cracked. A deep chill ran through him as he touched the handle, the metal shockingly cold against his palm. He pushed the door open, and it gave way with a reluctant creak. The room was empty, except for a tall, narrow figure standing in the corner, shrouded in shadows. Its back was turned to him, the long coat hanging from its frame tattered and stained. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure shifted. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it began to turn toward him, but there was no sound, no shuffling of fabric, no footsteps, only the unbearable silence that filled the room like a vacuum. As it turned, Ethan's mind screamed for him to run, to flee, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. The hollow man faced him now, its features obscured in the dim light. But there were no eyes in its hollowed-out sockets, no mouth to scream or speak, only an endless, empty void where a face should have been. Ethan stumbled back, his chest tight with terror, and the figure took a step forward. His heart raced, and finally, his legs responded, carrying him back down the hallway in a desperate sprint. The walls seemed to close in on him, narrowing with each passing second. Behind him, he could feel the presence of the hollow man, hear the soft scraping of its steps as it followed. He reached the top of the staircase, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and as he looked down, the stairs seemed to stretch downward into an infinite abyss. The house was warping, changing, the shadows crawling up the walls like living things. He had no choice but to run down them, his feet barely finding purchase on the steps as they twisted beneath him. The hollow man was still behind him, always just behind him, its presence an unrelenting weight that pressed down on his mind, squeezing tighter with every second. Ethan's vision blurred as he reached the bottom, his body trembling as he slammed into the front door with all his strength. The hinges groaned, and the door burst open, spilling him out onto the porch. He stumbled forward, his knees hitting the rotting wood, but he didn't stop. He forced himself up, running to his car, the cold air biting into his lungs. Behind him, the house loomed in the mist, the front door now wide open, an inky blackness seeping out from within. Ethan fumbled with his keys, finally wrenching the car door open and throwing himself inside. He slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he turned the ignition. The car sputtered, the engine refusing to start. His pulse thundered in his ears, each second stretching into eternity as the fog thickened around the car, swallowing everything. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. The hollow man stood at the edge of the porch, watching him, its faceless head tilted slightly, and for a moment, the air felt too still, too quiet. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. The engine roared to life, and he sped away from the house, the mist parting just enough to reveal the road ahead. The house disappeared behind him, swallowed by the fog once more. But the hollow feeling remained. Chapter 2. The Whispering Forest. Ethan drove through the night, the road winding like a serpent through the dense forest. His heart still hammered in his chest, the memory of the hollow man lingering in his mind, a presence that refused to fade. The narrow beams of his headlights cut through the thickening fog, illuminating only the immediate stretch of cracked asphalt ahead. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The farther he drove, the more isolated the world around him became. The forest was ancient, the trees towering and twisted, their bark blackened and gnarled. A thick canopy overhead blotted out the moonlight, casting the road into deep, unnatural darkness. The sound of his tires crunching over the debris of fallen leaves and branches was the only noise, a hollow echo in the silence of the woods. Every now and then, Ethan would catch movement in the corners of his vision, quick, darting shadows that vanished the moment he turned his head. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the leather, as if holding on to something tangible might keep him tethered to reality. The mist grew thicker the deeper he ventured into the forest, swirling in strange patterns, as if it had a will of its own. It rolled off the trees and pooled in the hollows along the roadside, spilling over like smoke from an unseen fire. His headlights flickered for a moment, dimming before they regained their strength. He pressed down on the gas, anxious to escape the suffocating grip of the fog. But the road seemed endless. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. It was impossible to tell. The woods stretched on and on, the road twisting back upon itself like a maze with no exit. His phone lay useless in the passenger seat, the signal lost as soon as he had entered the forest. The quiet pressed in from all sides, thick and oppressive, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the steady thrum of his own heartbeat. It was as though the world outside the forest no longer existed, as though he had crossed some invisible boundary into a place that had been forgotten by time. As Ethan drove, a strange feeling began to settle over him, a sense of being watched. His skin prickled, and he found himself glancing into the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see something, a shape, a figure, lurking in the darkness behind him. But the road was always empty. The trees lined up like sentinels, unmoving, their twisted branches casting long shadows that slithered across the ground like serpents. Then, up ahead, a fork in the road appeared, barely visible through the swirling mist. One path veered sharply to the right, disappearing into the thick of the trees, while the other continued straight into the unknown. Ethan slowed the car, uncertainty gnawing at him. There had been no signs, no indications of where either road might lead. For a moment, he hesitated, staring down the two paths, trying to make sense of the strange pull he felt toward the right. He chose the straight path. The moment he did, the forest seemed to respond. The trees pressed closer, the branches above knitting together until the sky was completely blotted out. The mist grew thicker, heavier, wrapping around the car like a shroud. His visibility dropped to only a few feet, and he was forced to slow down, squinting into the haze. The forest whispered to him now, a faint, rustling sound that rose and fell like the distant murmur of voices. It was too low to be understood, but it was constant, filling the air with a steady hum that set his teeth on edge. The road beneath him began to change. The asphalt cracked and crumbled, giving way to a rough, uneven surface covered in moss and creeping vines. His tires skidded on the slick ground, and he fought to keep control of the car as it lurched and shuddered over the uneven terrain. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the trees themselves were trying to speak, to convey something vital and ancient. Ethan's pulse quickened, his palms slick with sweat as he gripped the wheel. Suddenly, a shape loomed ahead in the mist, a tall, dark figure standing in the middle of the road. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. His heart thundered in his chest as he peered through the windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a man, or something that resembled one. Tall and thin, the figure was draped in a long, tattered cloak that billowed around it in the breeze. Its head was bowed, face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows over its features. For a moment, neither moved. Ethan's breath fogged the glass as he stared, his pulse racing. The figure stood perfectly still, as though it had been waiting for him. Then, without warning, the figure stepped off the road and vanished into the trees. Ethan sat frozen in the car, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. The whispering grew louder now, the trees creaking and groaning as if alive. He glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure behind him, but the road was empty once more. A cold dread settled over him, heavier than before. The car wouldn't start. Ethan's heart sank as he twisted the key in the ignition again and again, but the engine only sputtered in response. The dashboard lights flickered once before going dark, and the silence that followed was deafening. He sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, his breath coming in shallow, rapid bursts. The forest around him seemed to close in, the whispering now a cacophony of voices, all speaking in a language he could not understand. He opened the car door, stepping out into the thick, choking mist. The air was colder here, damp and heavy with the scent of moss and decay. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost spongy, and each step he took was swallowed by the thick layer of leaves that carpeted the forest floor. He moved cautiously toward the spot where the figure had disappeared, his eyes scanning the treeline for any sign of movement. The woods were silent now. He ventured further, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his senses heightened. The trees loomed above him, ancient and foreboding, their twisted trunks covered in thick, wet moss. The whispering had stopped, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet the feeling of being watched remained, an invisible weight pressing down on him, making it difficult to breathe. As Ethan moved deeper into the forest, he began to notice something strange. The trees, though massive and seemingly endless, were not normal. Their bark was covered in deep, unnatural grooves, as though something had scratched at them, clawing its way up toward the sky. Some of the trees bore strange symbols, etched into the wood with a precision that unsettled him. The symbols were ancient, unfamiliar, and yet they seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy. A clearing appeared ahead, bathed in an eerie, silver light that seemed to seep through the fog. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone altar, covered in moss and lichen. Surrounding it were several weathered statues, their forms almost human but distorted. Limbs too long, faces twisted in grotesque expressions of agony. The air here was colder still, biting into his skin as he stepped into the clearing. The altar was old, ancient, its surface stained dark with something Ethan didn't want to think about. The statues loomed over it like silent sentinels, their hollow eyes fixed on him, watching, waiting. He approached the altar slowly, a deep sense of unease settling over him. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. His eyes fell upon an object resting at the center of the altar, half covered in leaves and dirt. It was a small, ornate box, its surface intricately carved with more of the strange symbols that covered the trees. He reached out, hesitating for just a moment before lifting the box into his hands. It was heavier than it looked, the cold metal biting into his skin. A low hum filled the air as he opened the box. The whispering returned, louder and more urgent than before, rising in pitch until it became a deafening roar in his mind. The trees around the clearing shuddered, their branches thrashing violently as the wind picked up, swirling the mist into a chaotic frenzy. Ethan's heart pounded as he stared into the box. It was empty, but the forest was no longer silent. Something was coming. Chapter 3: Shadows in the Attic. The house stood still and silent as the fog crept in around its foundation, a layer of mist pressing itself against the ancient stone walls. From the outside, it appeared no different than it had for decades, abandoned, forgotten, and half consumed by the forest that surrounded it. Its broken windows stared out like empty eyes, and the gabled roof sagged under years of neglect. But tonight, something inside stirred. Far above, in the cramped, shadow-choked attic, the air was thick and stagnant, filled with the scent of old wood, mildew, and dust. For years, the attic had been undisturbed, its contents locked away from the world, hidden beneath a film of decay. The space was crammed with relics from another time. Warped furniture, trunks filled with forgotten clothes, and boxes that sagged under the weight of years. Cobwebs draped across the low beams like curtains, and the only sound was the soft rustling of unseen creatures moving through the walls. Ethan stood at the base of the narrow staircase that led up into the attic, his heart thudding in his chest. The shadows above seemed thicker here, more oppressive, as though something unnatural lingered just beyond the threshold, waiting for him. His skin prickled as he placed one foot on the first step, the old wood groaning under his weight. He climbed slowly, his breath coming in shallow bursts, each step a deliberate, cautious movement. The air grew colder the higher he went, the temperature dropping to a chill that seeped into his bones. By the time he reached the top, his breath was visible in the dim light, fogging up the narrow window at the far end of the attic. Moonlight filtered through the grime-streaked glass, casting long, angular shadows across the floor. The attic seemed larger than it should have been, stretching out into the darkness in ways that made no sense. The walls bowed inward slightly, as if the house itself was slowly collapsing under its own weight. Ethan's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he could make out the shapes of forgotten furniture and old trunks scattered around the room, their forms draped in sheets of dust-covered cloth. The air here was thick with stillness, as though time itself had stopped in this forgotten place. His pulse quickened as he moved further into the attic. Something had drawn him here, something beyond his control. He could feel it, a pull deep within his chest, a sensation that made his skin crawl. It wasn't curiosity that drove him, nor fear. It was something else, something far more insidious. As he stepped carefully around a toppled chair, his foot brushed against something on the floor. He looked down to see a trail of dust disturbed, as if something, or someone, had recently passed through. His eyes followed the trail, leading him toward the far corner of the attic where the shadows seemed to gather, thick and impenetrable. His heart raced as he moved closer, the darkness swallowing him whole. There, half hidden beneath a pile of discarded linens, was an old trunk. It was large, its metal corners tarnished with age, and a thick layer of dust coated its surface. The trunk looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, yet the lock on its front was broken, the latch hanging loosely, as if it had been opened recently. Ethan knelt in front of it, his fingers trembling as he brushed away the dust. He lifted the lid. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound loud in the oppressive silence of the attic. Inside, the trunk was filled with a collection of old, tattered clothes, their fabric worn and moth-eaten. But beneath them, something glinted in the faint light. Ethan pushed the clothes aside, revealing a small, weathered box, much like the one he had found in the forest clearing. His pulse quickened as he reached for it, his hand brushing against the cold metal. The box was heavy, its surface etched with strange, archaic symbols that mirrored the ones carved into the trees in the forest. As he lifted it from the trunk, a strange energy seemed to pulse through the air, vibrating through his fingertips. The temperature in the attic plummeted further, the cold biting into his skin. Ethan placed the box on the floor in front of him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The attic seemed to shift around him, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker, more suffocating. He hesitated for a moment, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But something deeper, more primal, urged him on. With a deep breath, he opened the box. A wave of icy air rushed out, swirling around him, and the attic groaned as if the very bones of the house were shifting. Inside the box lay a single object, a small, black key, cold and smooth to the touch. It was unlike any key he had ever seen. Its surface intricately carved with the same strange symbols that adorned the box and the trees. It looked ancient, as though it had been crafted long before the house had even been built. The moment he touched the key, a low rumble reverberated through the attic, shaking the floorboards beneath him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the shadows around him began to move, twisting and writhing as though alive. The temperature dropped again, the cold now unbearable, sinking deep into his bones. He stood, the key clutched tightly in his hand, and turned to face the attic. The shadows were no longer just shapes cast by the dim light. They had formed now, substance, moving through the room like a living entity. They slithered along the walls, pooling in the corners, stretching toward him with cold, grasping fingers. Ethan backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. The shadows followed him, creeping closer with each passing second. His eyes darted toward the narrow staircase, his only escape. But before he could move, something shifted in the darkness, a figure, tall and indistinct, standing at the far end of the attic. It was barely more than a silhouette, its form wrapped in shadow, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him, piercing through the gloom. The figure took a step forward, and the shadows seemed to ripple in response, drawing closer to him. Ethan stumbled backward, his pulse racing, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. The attic was alive now, the walls creaking and groaning as the shadows twisted and contorted around him. The figure moved closer, its form becoming clearer in the dim light. Its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, its body draped in a long, tattered cloak. It was the Hollow Man. Ethan's blood turned to ice as the figure continued to advance, its movements slow, deliberate. The shadows seemed to reach out from the figure itself, tendrils of darkness slithering along the floor toward him. His hand tightened around the key, the cold metal biting into his skin, and without thinking, he turned and fled. He ran toward the staircase, his footsteps heavy and uneven as the attic floor shifted beneath him. The shadows lashed out, curling around his legs, pulling at his clothes, but he fought against them, stumbling down the stairs. The house groaned in protest, the very walls seeming to bend and twist as he descended. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The attic door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, the sound echoing through the empty house. Ethan collapsed at the bottom of the stairs, his body trembling, the key still clutched tightly in his hand. The house fell silent once more, but the darkness remained, heavy and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. He was not alone. The Hollow Man had followed him. Chapter 4: The Silent Hunt. Ethan's footsteps echoed faintly in the narrow hallway as he fled the attic, his mind reeling. The key in his hand felt like ice, a cold weight that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. He could feel it throbbing, as if it was alive, as if it was waiting for something. Something terrible. The house groaned around him, the old wood shifting under the pressure of the unseen force that now seemed to haunt its very bones. The walls were narrow and confining, lined with peeling wallpaper that curled at the edges, revealing bare wood underneath. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten memories, and dust coated every surface, rising in soft clouds with each hurried step he took. The air was heavy, stagnant, filled with the scent of decay and something far older, something that shouldn't have existed in this world. He needed to get out. The staircase creaked beneath him as he descended, each step sending a shiver through the old house. His pulse raced, pounding in his ears, as if the very rhythm of his heart was echoing through the ancient wood. The hollow man had followed him from the attic. He could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing down on him, the shadows growing thicker with each second that passed. There was no sound of footsteps behind him, but Ethan knew it was there, lurking in the dark, watching, waiting. The house shifted around him, the layout no longer making sense. Hallways twisted in strange directions, and doors appeared where they shouldn't have been. Rooms that had once led to familiar places now opened into dark, yawning voids. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if the house itself was alive, reshaping itself to trap him. He stopped in front of a heavy, ornate door at the end of a narrow corridor, his chest heaving. His breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air burning his lungs. The door was old, its surface covered in intricate carvings, symbols that mirrored those he had seen on the trees in the forest and the strange box in the attic. The key in his hand seemed to vibrate, its icy touch burning into his palm. Without thinking, he inserted the key into the lock. The door groaned open, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase that descended into the depths of the house. Ethan hesitated, glancing back down the hallway. The shadows had grown denser, creeping toward him like tendrils of smoke, twisting and curling along the floor and walls. He could feel them pulling at him, urging him to stay, to let the darkness claim him. But he couldn't stay. He stepped onto the staircase, the old stone cold beneath his feet. The air here was different, thicker, darker, as though the very light was being swallowed by the shadows. The steps wound down into the earth, deeper and deeper, twisting in ways that made his head spin. The deeper he descended, the more the weight of the house seemed to press down on him, the walls closing in, suffocating him with their oppressive presence. As he reached the bottom, the staircase opened into a cavernous chamber, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. The floor was covered in a thin layer of water, its surface reflecting the faint, flickering light that seeped in from cracks in the walls. The air was cold, the dampness seeping into his clothes, chilling him to the bone. The shadows here were different, thicker, more solid, moving with purpose as they clung to the walls and floors, writhing like living creatures. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, similar to the one in the forest but larger, more imposing. Its surface was cracked and weathered, covered in the same strange symbols that seemed to haunt him wherever he went. The key in his hand pulsed, and he stepped toward the altar, drawn to it by an unseen force. The moment his hand touched the cold stone, the chamber came alive. The shadows surged forward, racing along the walls and floor, their forms twisting and coiling like serpents. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the air filled with a low, guttural hum that vibrated deep in his chest. The key in his hand grew colder, the chill biting into his skin as if it were feeding off the energy in the room. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding. The walls of the chamber seemed to ripple, shifting like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen current. The hum grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. The air thickened, pressing against his skin, making it hard to breathe. Then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It moved with an unnatural grace, its form draped in shadow, barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded it. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, as though it was not bound by the same physical laws that governed the world. Ethan's pulse quickened as the figure approached, its face hidden beneath a hood, its body cloaked in the same tattered fabric as the hollow man. But this was not the Hollow Man. The figure's presence was colder, darker, more malevolent. It moved slowly, deliberately, its form distorting as it passed through the shadows, as if it was part of them. Ethan backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The key in his hand pulsed again, the cold now unbearable, burning into his skin. The figure reached the altar and stopped, its head turning slowly toward him. Ethan's legs trembled as a wave of fear washed over him, paralyzing him in place. The air in the chamber grew heavier, the shadows pressing in from all sides, as if the very fabric of the world was unraveling around him. And then the figure reached out. Its hand was pale, almost translucent, its long, spindly fingers tipped with sharp, blackened nails. It hovered just above the surface of the altar, a mere inch from the key that lay in Ethan's trembling hand. The cold that radiated from it was unbearable, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to drain the life from the air itself. Ethan's mind screamed at him to run, to flee from the darkness that surrounded him, but his body refused to obey. His muscles locked in place, frozen by the suffocating weight of fear that crushed down on him from all sides. The figure's hand moved closer, its fingers brushing against the edge of the key. The chamber exploded in light. Blinding, searing light filled the room, burning away the shadows, banishing the darkness that had clung to the walls and floor. The figure recoiled, its form twisting and writhing as the light engulfed it, its long, pale fingers curling into claws. The walls trembled, and the ground beneath Ethan's feet shook violently, as though the earth itself was protesting the sudden intrusion of light into its domain. The figure screamed, though no sound reached Ethan's ears. Its form twisted and distorted, shrinking into itself as the light burned away its shadowy cloak. Ethan staggered back, shielding his eyes from the brilliant light, his pulse racing. The key in his hand glowed white-hot, searing his palm, but he couldn't let go, couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure as it disintegrated before him. The light dimmed, leaving the chamber bathed in an eerie, ethereal glow. The figure was gone, and the shadows had retreated to the far corners of the room, where they clung to the walls like frightened animals. The hum in the air had quieted, replaced by a soft, almost rhythmic thrum that seemed to emanate from the key in Ethan's hand. He stood in the center of the chamber, his body trembling, his breath ragged. The key was warm now, its surface no longer cold and menacing. The altar before him had changed, the strange symbols etched into its surface glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the key's rhythm. For a moment, the world was still, but in the silence, Ethan knew something had changed. The Hollow Man was still out there, somewhere in the house. The shadows that lingered at the edges of the chamber were only biding their time, waiting for the light to fade, waiting for the darkness to return. And when it did, Ethan knew he wouldn't be able to escape it again. Chapter 5. The Hall of Mirrors. The house had grown colder. Ethan could feel the chill settling deep into his bones as he climbed back up the winding staircase from the chamber below. His legs ached, each step heavier than the last, as though the weight of the key in his hand was pulling him down into the earth. His clothes clung to his damp skin, soaked through from the icy mist that had risen from the chamber floor, and his breath fogged the air in front of him, barely visible in the dim light that filtered down from above. As he reached the top of the stairs, the house greeted him with an eerie silence, its walls looming around him like silent sentinels. The hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long. The doors that lined either side faded into darkness. The wallpaper, once an elegant pattern of vines and flowers, was now peeling away in long strips, revealing the rotten wood beneath. The air was thick with dust, disturbed only by his shallow breaths and the soft creak of the floor beneath his feet. Ethan paused, his hand tightening around the key. There was a sense of something watching him, a presence lurking just out of sight, hiding in the shadows that clung to the walls and ceiling. He could feel it, the weight of its gaze, cold and unrelenting, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the house was still, as if holding its breath. He moved forward, his footsteps slow and measured. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, each step leading him further away from the safety of the light and deeper into the heart of the house. The shadows thickened around him, coiling and twisting like tendrils, brushing against his skin as he passed. His pulse quickened, and his grip tightened on the key, the metal now cool and solid in his hand. The hallway opened into a large room, the walls lined with tall, arched mirrors that reflected the faint, flickering light from the chandelier above. Ethan stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The mirrors were old, their surfaces streaked with dust and grime, but they reflected the room in perfect clarity. Each one stretched from floor to ceiling, their ornate frames tarnished with age, but still intricate, the carvings depicting twisted vines and strange, unrecognizable symbols. The air in the room was unnaturally cold, a deep chill that seeped into his skin, turning his breath into clouds of mist. The mirrors distorted his reflection as he moved deeper into the room, warping his image in subtle, unsettling ways. His face appeared elongated, his eyes sunken, his body twisted in ways that defied logic. But it was the figures in the mirrors, just at the edge of his vision, that made his stomach churn. In the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Ethan turned sharply, his heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the empty room reflected back at him in the mirrors. He scanned the other reflections, his pulse quickening as his gaze darted from one mirror to the next. But the figures, those shadowy, indistinct forms, remained just out of sight, moving in ways that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He took a step closer to one of the mirrors, his reflection staring back at him, pale and gaunt, the shadows swirling around him like a living thing. As he approached, the reflection shifted, and for a brief moment, it wasn't his face staring back at him. The face was older, weathered, its eyes sunken deep into their sockets, the skin drawn tight over the bones. It was a face he didn't recognize, but one that filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. The face blinked. Ethan recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest. The reflection shifted again, and it was his face once more, pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. He glanced around the room, the mirrors lining the walls, their reflections twisting and distorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The figures in the mirrors moved in the corners of his vision, slithering through the shadows, their movements unnatural, their forms indistinct. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him from all sides. The chandelier above flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. Ethan could feel something, some presence, drawing closer, creeping toward him through the reflections, its form hidden in the darkness. His skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, but when he turned to look, there was nothing. He moved to the center of the room, his heart racing, the key clenched tightly in his hand. The mirrors reflected his every move, but something was wrong. In the reflection of one of the mirrors, the room was not empty. Behind his distorted image, he saw the shadow of a figure, tall and thin, its body draped in a tattered cloak, its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The Hollow Man. Ethan's pulse quickened as the figure moved closer, its shadowy form gliding silently through the room, undisturbed by the light or the mirrors. It moved with an unnatural grace, its limbs too long, its body too fluid, as though it was part of the shadows themselves. The mirrors reflected its every step, the figure growing closer with each second, its presence suffocating, the air thick with its malevolence. The Hollow Man reached out a hand, its long, pale fingers brushing against the surface of the mirror. The glass rippled under its touch, the reflection distorting further, warping the room and Ethan's image along with it. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so low that frost began to form on the surface of the mirrors, spreading in delicate, intricate patterns. Ethan backed away, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His eyes darted from one mirror to the next, but the Hollow Man was everywhere now, its form reflected in every surface, moving closer and closer with each passing second. The mirrors seemed to twist and bend, the room warping around him, trapping him in a maze of reflections that distorted his perception of reality. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, his body trembling with fear. The Hollow Man's reflection loomed over him, its face still hidden, but its presence overwhelming, filling the room with a suffocating darkness. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the shadows closing in around him, pressing in from all sides. And then, the mirrors began to crack. The sound was sharp, piercing, as spiderweb fractures spread across the surface of the glass. The cracks radiated outward from the hollow man's reflection, splintering the mirrors, distorting the reflections even further. Ethan's pulse raced as the cracks spread faster, the glass splintering into jagged shards, each one reflecting the hollow man in fragments, multiplying its presence, making it impossible to escape. The chandelier flickered again, the light dimming, casting the room into near-total darkness. The only light came from the fractured reflections in the mirrors, each shard glowing faintly, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the room. Ethan could feel the hollow man's presence drawing closer, the air growing colder, the darkness pressing in. With a sudden, violent crack, one of the mirrors shattered completely, the glass exploding outward in a shower of jagged shards. The sound echoed through the room, deafening in the silence, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw the hollow man's true form, tall and skeletal, its face a hollow void, its body draped in tattered, blackened rags. But the vision was fleeting. The room plunged into darkness, the mirrors now completely shattered, their reflective surfaces lying in broken pieces on the floor. Ethan stood in the center of the room, his heart racing, the key still clutched tightly in his hand. The air was still, the house eerily silent once more. But the hollow man was still there. He could feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching him, waiting for the moment to strike. The mirrors may have shattered, but the presence that haunted them had not been banished. It was still with him, closer than ever, its malevolent gaze fixed on him, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out from the darkness. The hunt had begun. Ethan knew he couldn't escape the house. Not yet. The hollow man was hunting him, and the key in his hand was the only thing standing between him and the darkness that sought to consume him. The mirrors had shown him the truth. The house was not what it seemed. It was a labyrinth, a trap, designed to keep him here, to feed the shadows that lurked within its walls. And the hollow man would not stop until it had him. Chapter 6. The Labyrinth Below. The air in the house had grown stifling, thick with an invisible weight that pressed down on Ethan's chest, making it harder to breathe. The shattered mirrors behind him felt like a distant memory, though the tension in the air remained as sharp as broken glass. The hollow man was somewhere close, closer than ever before. Its presence lingered in every shadow, waiting just beyond the edge of his vision. But there was no turning back now. The only way out was forward. Ethan moved down a long corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity, the walls narrowing as he went. The house had taken on a life of its own, its architecture twisting and warping like the shifting shapes of a nightmare. Hallways that had once been familiar now branched in unnatural ways, leading him deeper into a maze of cold stone, rotten wood, and suffocating darkness. The flickering light of the chandeliers was gone. Now there was only the faint glow of the key he held in his hand. It pulsed with a low, almost inaudible hum, a rhythm that synchronized with his heartbeat. Ahead, a staircase descended into darkness, the steps slick with moisture, the wood old and crumbling. The walls here were damp, the smell of mildew overpowering. He paused at the top, glancing back once to the corridor behind him, but it had already changed. What had once been a straight path now twisted in on itself, the walls converging like the jaws of some great beast, trapping him in its maw. There was no escape that way. The staircase beckoned, and Ethan had no choice but to follow it. As he stepped down, the air grew colder still, biting at his skin, leaving a thin layer of frost along the edges of the stone steps. His breath came in short, foggy bursts as he descended deeper, the stairs spiraling into an abyss of endless dark. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as though the house itself was pushing down on him, squeezing the very life out of his body. The bottom of the staircase opened into a cavernous room, vast and echoing, its walls disappearing into the shadows. The floor was made of smooth stone, slick with water, reflecting the faint light of the key in his hand. A low fog clung to the ground, swirling around his feet as he stepped forward, his footsteps reverberating in the emptiness. He could see his breath in the cold air, each exhale forming into mist before disappearing into the fog that covered the floor. The room was filled with towering stone pillars, arranged in no discernible pattern, their surfaces covered in the same strange symbols he had seen carved into the trees and on the altar. The marks glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the key, as though they were connected by some unseen force. The pillars rose into the darkness above, disappearing into the black void that seemed to stretch endlessly overhead. Ethan moved carefully between the pillars, the sound of his footsteps the only thing breaking the heavy silence. The fog swirled around him, thicker now, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He could feel the cold stone beneath his feet, slick with water, but there was something else too, a strange, almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to pulse through the ground, as if the very earth beneath him was alive. In the distance, something shifted. The movement was subtle at first, just a ripple in the fog, but Ethan's senses were on high alert. His pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his chest as he stopped and scanned the room. The pillars stood still, silent and imposing, but the fog was moving. It coiled and twisted in unnatural patterns, slithering across the floor like a living thing. He watched as it swirled around the base of the pillars, forming shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. A low, distant hum filled the air, barely audible but growing louder with each passing second. Ethan's grip on the key tightened, the metal now warm against his skin, pulsing in rhythm with the hum. His breath caught in his throat as the fog parted, revealing something that made his blood run cold. Ahead, at the far end of the room, a massive stone doorway loomed, its surface covered in intricate carvings that glowed with an eerie, pale light. The door was ancient, far older than the house above. It seemed out of place here, as though it had been buried long ago, forgotten beneath the earth, waiting for someone to find it. The symbols carved into its surface mirrored those on the key, their glow growing brighter as he approached. But it wasn't the door that made his heart race. It was what stood in front of it, the Hollow Man. It stood perfectly still, its tall, gaunt form cloaked in darkness. Its wide-brimmed hat obscured its face, casting a deep shadow that swallowed its features. But Ethan could feel its gaze, cold, empty, and unwavering. The Hollow Man's long, bony fingers twitched at its sides, and the fog swirled around its feet as if drawn to it, wrapping itself around its form like a shroud. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting as the Hollow Man took a slow step forward. Its movements were deliberate, almost graceful, as it glided across the slick stone floor, closing the distance between them. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat, his body frozen in place, the weight of the Hollow Man's presence pressing down on him like a physical force. He couldn't move, couldn't run. The key in his hand flared with a sudden burst of light. The Hollow Man stopped, its head tilting slightly as if in response to the key's glow. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the hum in the air growing louder, vibrating deep in Ethan's chest. The pillars surrounding them began to pulse with the same light, the symbols etched into their surfaces glowing brighter and brighter until the room was bathed in an ethereal light. The Hollow Man did not retreat. Instead, it raised one long, skeletal hand and pointed toward the door behind it. The air around the door shimmered, distorting as if reality itself was bending and warping under the weight of some immense, unseen force. The carvings on the door pulsed with light, the symbols growing more defined, more distinct. Ethan's legs trembled as he took a hesitant step forward, the key in his hand glowing even brighter, its warmth seeping into his skin. The Hollow Man remained still, its fingers still pointing toward the door. The fog swirled around its feet, twisting and coiling like a living thing, but it made no move to stop him. He moved closer to the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The stone surface seemed to vibrate with energy, the carvings pulsing in time with the key. He could feel the power emanating from it, ancient and terrible, something far older than the house above, something that should have remained buried. The key pulsed once more in his hand, and without thinking, he raised it to the door. The moment the key touched the stone, The ground beneath him shook violently, the pillars trembling as the entire room seemed to shift and buckle. The symbols on the door flared with a blinding light, and the hum in the air rose to a deafening pitch, drowning out all other sound. Ethan staggered back, shielding his eyes from the light as the door began to creak open. A blast of icy wind tore through the room, sending the fog swirling in a frenzy. The hollow man stood unmoving as the door opened wider, revealing a dark, yawning abyss beyond. The wind howled, carrying with it the faintest whispers of voices, voices that had long since been forgotten, buried deep within the earth. Ethan's heart raced as he stared into the void beyond the door. It was nothingness, an endless expanse of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. The key in his hand grew cold once more, its light fading as the door fully opened, revealing the true depths of the labyrinth below. And in that moment, Ethan understood. The house had never been what it seemed. It was a doorway, a gateway to something far darker, something far older than he could have ever imagined. And the hollow man was its guardian, a watcher of the threshold, waiting for someone to unlock the door. He had been the key all along. The hollow man moved then, stepping into the void, its form disappearing into the darkness beyond. The wind howled louder, the voices growing more distinct, more insistent, calling to him from the abyss. The door stood open, waiting. Ethan hesitated, the cold air biting at his skin, the darkness calling to him. And then, with a final deep breath, he stepped into the void. Chapter 7. The Abyss Beckons. The darkness closed around Ethan like a suffocating veil as he stepped through the massive stone door. His body tensed with the biting cold that rushed over him, so intense it felt as though the chill had seeped into his bones. The air here was different, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was thick with unseen weight, pressing down on his lungs, making each breath a struggle. There was no light, not even the faintest glow from the key he still gripped in his hand. He couldn't see more than a few inches in front of him. The darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow every trace of existence, even his sense of self. The ground beneath his feet was hard, uneven stone, but each step he took echoed endlessly, as if the space stretched on forever, an empty void with no beginning and no end. As he moved forward, cautiously feeling his way, the oppressive silence settled in. It wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum, an absence of sound so profound that his own heartbeat seemed deafening in his ears. There was nothing. No distant wind, no creaking of the house above, no life at all. Just Ethan and the darkness, which pressed in closer with every step. The door behind him had long since disappeared from sight, as though it had never existed. All that remained now was the stone beneath his feet and the endless void before him. He kept walking, though he had no sense of direction, no destination in mind. Only the instinctual drive to move forward, away from whatever horrors lay behind him. The further he ventured into the abyss, the more the darkness seemed to shift around him. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive, moving with a subtle, almost imperceptible current. He felt it brushing against his skin, tugging at his clothes, as though the air itself was infused with something watching, an awareness in the void. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows around him were not just empty, but sentient. His breathing quickened as the oppressive atmosphere pressed in tighter. His mind raced, trying to grasp what had happened, where he had gone. This place felt ancient, older than anything human-made, more like a dimension outside of time, where forgotten things drifted endlessly. A place of the lost. The air was cold and wet now, with the faintest smell of decay hanging in the stagnant air. The stone beneath his feet became slick with moisture, and he slipped slightly as he moved forward, catching himself just before he fell. There was something beneath the surface here, something seeping up from below. It was as if the stone floor had been saturated with centuries of water, rotting and dissolving into something else entirely. Then, the ground beneath him shifted. It was subtle at first, a soft tremor that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest, straining to listen to the stillness around him. The tremor came again, stronger this time, a deep rumble that vibrated through the stone beneath his feet. It wasn't coming from the ground itself, but from somewhere deeper, something stirring beneath the surface. The tremor intensified, the floor beneath him shaking violently, forcing him to steady himself against the invisible force. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the space, a deep groan that rose from the very heart of the abyss. It was the sound of something enormous waking from a long slumber, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. Ethan's pulse raced as the rumbling grew louder, the ground beneath him beginning to buckle and crack. The once solid stone floor began to split apart, jagged fissures snaking across the ground like veins of darkness. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the uneven surface as he tried to escape the growing chaos. But there was nowhere to run. The abyss stretched endlessly in every direction, the darkness swallowing everything. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath him. Ethan fell. The sensation was immediate and terrifying. A sudden drop that left his stomach lurching in his chest. He tumbled downward, through the darkness, the air rushing past him in a deafening roar. His body twisted in the void, the cold wind biting at his skin as he plummeted deeper into the abyss. There was nothing to grab onto, no ledge to stop his fall. Just the endless drop, a free fall into nothingness. Time lost all meaning as he fell. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours. There was no end to the descent. His body spun helplessly, his arms flailing as he tried to orient himself. But the abyss offered no clues. He was weightless, trapped in an eternal fall. Then, without warning, he hit the ground. The impact was sudden and brutal, the force of it knocking the wind from his lungs. He lay there for a moment, dazed and gasping for breath, the shock of the landing reverberating through his body. The stone beneath him was hard and cold, jagged edges digging into his back. His head throbbed, his vision swimming as he struggled to regain his bearings. When his vision finally cleared, he found himself lying on the edge of a massive chasm. The abyss had changed. He was no longer in a formless void, but at the edge of a vast, subterranean cavern. The chasm stretched out before him, its depths hidden by a swirling mist that clung to the jagged rocks far below. Massive stone columns rose from the darkness, disappearing into the vaulted ceiling above, their surfaces covered in the same strange symbols that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The walls of the cavern were alive with movement. Shadows slithered and crawled along the stone, their forms indistinct but malevolent. Ethan watched as they coiled around the pillars, their dark tendrils reaching out into the empty space, searching for something or someone. A narrow, crumbling bridge stretched across the chasm, connecting the two sides of the cavern. It was made of the same slick stone as the floor beneath him, its surface uneven and treacherous. The bridge looked ancient, as though it had been built long before human hands had touched this place, its stones worn smooth by the passage of time. Ethan rose to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him as he approached the bridge. There was no other way forward, only the narrow path across the chasm, suspended over the misty void below. His heart raced as he placed one foot on the bridge, testing its stability. The stone groaned beneath his weight, but it held. He moved slowly, carefully, his eyes fixed on the far end of the bridge. The mist swirled around him as he crossed, the cold air biting at his skin, making his limbs feel heavy and sluggish. The shadows along the walls watched his every move, their dark shapes shifting and writhing. But they did not approach. They waited. As he reached the center of the bridge, the tremors returned. The ground beneath him shook violently, the stone bridge swaying precariously over the chasm. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled, his arms flailing as he tried to regain his balance. The mist below churned and roiled, the distant sound of something massive moving beneath the surface. A deep, echoing growl rumbled through the cavern, vibrating through the stone. The sound was ancient, primal, like the voice of the earth itself, rising from the depths. The shadows along the walls surged forward, their dark tendrils reaching out toward him, drawn to the source of the sound. The bridge shook again, the tremors growing more violent with each passing second. The stone beneath his feet began to crack, fissures spreading across its surface like a spider's web. He could feel the bridge crumbling beneath him, the jagged rocks below calling to him, ready to swallow him whole. In a desperate bid for survival, Ethan sprinted the last few steps across the bridge, his legs burning with the effort. The moment his feet touched solid ground on the other side, the bridge collapsed behind him, the stone crumbling into the chasm with a deafening crash. The mist below swallowed the debris, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. He stood there, panting and trembling, his heart racing in his chest. The shadows retreated, slithering back into the walls of the cavern, their dark presence fading as the growl from the depths subsided. But the sense of danger remained, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next moment to strike. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The abyss had claimed him, and there was no turning back. He had stepped into a world where the rules of reality no longer applied, a place where ancient forces moved unseen, and the darkness itself was alive. And whatever was waiting for him in the depths was far from finished. Chapter 8. The Spiral Descent. The darkness seemed to thicken around Ethan as he stood on the narrow ledge, staring into the abyss that loomed ahead. The collapse of the bridge had left the cavern eerily silent once again, the echo of falling stone long since fading into the mist below. Ethan's breaths came in short, ragged bursts, the cold air burning his throat as he struggled to calm the rapid beating of his heart. His mind raced with the realization of just how deep he had ventured into this nightmare, a place far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The path before him was narrow, jagged, and treacherous, carved into the side of the cavern wall like a spiral that descended into the unseen depths. The stone beneath his feet felt ancient, smooth in some places, rough and crumbling in others, as though it had withstood countless centuries of erosion. Small pebbles occasionally broke loose and tumbled into the fog below, disappearing without a sound. He knew there was no other way. Behind him lay the ruined bridge and the chasm that yawned with a silent, waiting hunger. To his left and right were the towering stone walls of the cavern, slick with condensation and covered in strange markings that glowed faintly in the gloom. Ahead, the spiral pathway curved downward, descending into the very heart of the earth. Ethan tightened his grip on the stone wall beside him, feeling the cold, damp surface beneath his fingers as he took the first step. The drop beside the narrow path was sheer, falling away into an endless void that seemed to pull at him with an unseen force. He kept his body pressed against the wall as he moved, his movements slow and deliberate, his heart pounding in his chest with every cautious step. The descent felt interminable. The pathway twisted and turned, sometimes so sharply that Ethan had to stop and catch his breath, the vertigo threatening to overwhelm him. The mist clung to the walls, swirling in strange patterns that seemed to move with a life of their own. Each step he took echoed into the darkness, but the sound was swallowed quickly, as if the abyss was absorbing everything: light, sound, even hope. At certain points along the descent, the path grew so narrow that he was forced to shuffle sideways, his back pressed flat against the stone wall, his feet barely fitting on the ledge. One wrong move, one slip of the foot, and he would plummet into the void below, swallowed by the abyss with no chance of survival. His muscles ached with the effort, his body tense from the constant strain of keeping his balance. There were moments when he stopped, his eyes scanning the darkness below, hoping for any sign of an end to the spiral. But there was nothing, only the same never-ending curve of the path, leading deeper into the earth, deeper into whatever malevolent force had drawn him here. The walls around him seemed to pulse with a strange energy, a low hum that vibrated through the stone and into his bones. It was as if the very structure of the place was alive, watching him, waiting for him to falter. The air grew colder the deeper he descended, the chill seeping into his skin, his clothes, and his very bones. His breath formed mist in the frigid air, and the stone beneath his feet became slick with frost. The cold bit into him with every step, draining the warmth from his body, leaving him numb and trembling. Yet he continued, driven by a force he didn't understand, a need to reach the bottom, to discover whatever lay at the heart of this place. As he rounded another sharp bend in the path, a faint glow appeared in the distance below. It was subtle at first, just a pale shimmer that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. But as he drew closer, the light grew brighter, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls of the cavern. The spiral pathway continued downward, but now Ethan could see that it was leading him toward something. A vast chamber that lay far below, illuminated by a strange, unnatural light. The sight of the light spurred him on, despite the growing exhaustion in his limbs. His legs ached with every step, his muscles burning from the strain of the descent, but he forced himself to keep moving. The path was still narrow and treacherous, but the promise of reaching the chamber below gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever was down there, it was the key to understanding the horrors he had faced. As the light grew closer, the mist began to thin, revealing more of the cavern's vast interior. The walls were smoother here, the carvings more intricate, glowing with a pale blue light that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. The spiral path widened slightly, giving him more room to maneuver, and the oppressive sense of being watched began to fade, replaced by a feeling of anticipation. Though whether it was dread or hope, Ethan couldn't tell. Finally, after what felt like hours of descending, the spiral path came to an end, opening into the vast chamber below. Ethan stepped cautiously onto the smooth stone floor, his eyes scanning the enormous space before him. The chamber was immense, its ceiling disappearing into the darkness above, while the floor stretched out in all directions, broken only by towering pillars that rose like ancient monoliths. The light emanated from the center of the room, where a massive stone altar stood, its surface covered in the same strange symbols that adorned the walls. The altar was the source of the pulsing glow, a steady rhythm of light that seemed to sync with the energy of the cavern itself. Ethan moved toward it, his steps slow and deliberate, the cold air biting at his skin. The light grew stronger as he approached, the hum in the air intensifying until it felt like the entire chamber was vibrating with the same energy. As he neared the altar, Ethan's attention was drawn to something at its base. A large, ornate mirror, its frame covered in intricate carvings that matched the symbols on the walls. The surface of the mirror was black, reflecting nothing but the abyss itself, as though it were a portal to another world entirely. The closer he got, the more he could feel the mirror's pull, a strange magnetic force that seemed to draw him in, urging him to step closer. He stood before the mirror, staring into its black surface, his reflection absent. The light from the altar flickered behind him, casting strange shadows on the walls, but the mirror remained dark, its surface smooth and untouched by the glow. Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his chest, a strange sense of inevitability washing over him as he reached out a hand, fingers trembling, toward the mirror's surface. The moment his fingers touched the glass, the air in the chamber shifted. A sudden, violent gust of wind swept through the room, whipping his hair and clothes as the light from the altar flared, blinding him with its intensity. The hum in the air rose to a deafening roar, the sound vibrating through his skull, making his vision swim. He staggered back, his hand jerking away from the mirror as the ground beneath him began to shake. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, pulsing with a frenetic energy that seemed to build with each passing second. The stone floor beneath his feet trembled, cracks appearing along its surface as the entire chamber seemed to pulse with the same rhythmic energy. The air grew thick with a strange, electric charge, and Ethan could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. And then, from the depths of the mirror, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark, amorphous shape that seemed to seep through the surface of the glass like smoke. But as it moved, it began to take form, solidifying into something more tangible, something more real. The shape grew larger, taller, until it towered over him, its form vaguely humanoid but distorted, twisted in unnatural ways. The creature's limbs were long and thin, its skin a mottled gray-black, like the texture of decaying stone. Its face was featureless, a smooth, blank surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Yet despite its lack of features, Ethan could feel its gaze on him, cold, piercing, and full of malice. The creature stepped out of the mirror, its movements slow and deliberate, each step sending a shockwave through the ground. The air around it crackled with energy, the hum in the chamber rising to a fever pitch as the symbols on the walls flared with light. The creature stood before him, its head tilting slightly as though it were studying him, evaluating him. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The air was heavy with the weight of something ancient and powerful, something beyond human comprehension. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the creature, frozen in place by its presence. And then, without warning, the creature lunged. Ethan barely had time to react, throwing himself to the side as the creature's long, bony arms swept through the air where he had just stood. The force of the attack sent a gust of wind rushing past him, nearly knocking him off his feet. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing as the creature turned toward him, its movements fluid and unnatural. There was no escape now. The creature was between him and the only path out of the chamber. The spiral descent had brought him here, but the way back was sealed by the monstrous being that had emerged from the mirror. This was the heart of the abyss, and there was no turning back. Chapter 9. The Terror Below. The creature's lunge had nearly killed him. Ethan scrambled across the smooth stone floor of the chamber, his breath coming in ragged gasps as his hands slid on the cold, wet surface. The creature moved with unnatural fluidity, its long limbs bending at impossible angles, each step sending vibrations through the ground. He could feel the presence of the thing behind him, a cold, suffocating weight that seemed to bear down on him as he fled. His body was screaming for rest, every muscle burning with exhaustion. His legs trembled beneath him, threatening to give out as he pushed himself to his feet, running in the only direction that didn't lead back to the abyssal chasm. The walls of the cavern loomed around him, vast and oppressive, their glowing symbols now dimming, as though the very life had been drained from them by the creature's emergence. The creature made no sound as it pursued him, no growls, no breath, no footsteps. It was as if it were an extension of the darkness itself, moving silently in the void, a shadow given form. But Ethan could feel it, sense it just behind him, the cold air thick with its presence. It was as if the space between them was shrinking with each passing second, the creature closing in, inch by inch, as Ethan's strength began to falter. The chamber stretched on endlessly, the flickering light from the altar behind him casting long shadows that danced across the floor and walls. The narrow stone passageways beyond the altar branched off into unknown depths, tunnels leading into the black heart of the earth. Ethan's thoughts raced. There was no way back. He couldn't return to the chasm, nor could he face the creature head-on. His only chance was to lose it in the maze of tunnels, to escape into the labyrinth below, where perhaps the creature's unnatural form might struggle to navigate the narrow, winding passages. He made a sharp turn, his feet skidding on the slick floor as he threw himself down one of the tunnels. The walls closed in around him, the ceiling lowering until he had to crouch slightly as he moved. His heart pounded in his chest, every breath painful and labored as he sprinted through the darkness. The air was colder here, mustier, with the unmistakable stench of rot and decay that clung to his nostrils. Behind him, the creature followed. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. Always there, just beyond his field of vision, waiting for him to tire, to slip. The narrow passageway seemed to offer little protection, its walls smooth and unyielding. The creature, despite its size, moved effortlessly, as if the space meant nothing to it. Ethan could hear the soft scraping of its limbs against the stone, a whisper of movement that sent a fresh wave of terror through his veins. The tunnel twisted and turned, splitting into smaller branches that led deeper into the earth. Ethan had no sense of direction now, only the instinctual drive to keep moving, to keep as much distance between himself and the thing that hunted him. The darkness was overwhelming, suffocating. The flickering light from his phone screen the only thing keeping him from running blindly into the abyss. The air grew colder, damper, as he descended further. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and his body shivered uncontrollably. The passageway became narrower, forcing him to duck his head and stoop lower as the ceiling pressed down from above. The cold stone walls brushed against his arms and shoulders as he moved, the space becoming claustrophobic, tighter with every step. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into another chamber, much smaller than the first. This one was dark, the walls slick with moisture, the floor uneven and crumbling in places. Strange markings, different from the ones in the main chamber, covered the walls, their meaning indecipherable but ominous. The air was thick with a foul, metallic scent that clung to the back of his throat, making him gag. At the center of the chamber was a large pit, its edges jagged and uneven, like a wound in the earth. A faint, sickly green glow emanated from within the pit, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. As he neared the edge, the stench of decay grew stronger, almost overwhelming, and he fought the urge to vomit. Peering over the edge, Ethan recoiled in horror. The pit was filled with bodies, hundreds, maybe thousands, stacked upon one another in a grotesque mass of twisted limbs and decaying flesh. The sight was nightmarish, the bodies bloated and discolored, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Many of them were partially decomposed, their skin sloughing off in sickening layers, revealing the bones beneath. The green glow seemed to emanate from within the pit itself, from somewhere deep beneath the mass of bodies. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, casting an otherworldly light on the macabre scene. Ethan's stomach churned, his head spinning as he staggered back from the edge, while rising in his throat. But there was no time to process the horror before him. The creature was still coming, and now there was no escape. The pit blocked his path, and the tunnel behind him led straight back to his pursuer. His mind raced, desperate for a solution. The walls were too smooth to climb, and the pit was too wide to jump. He was trapped. The only option was the pit itself. The thought made him sick, but he knew it was the only way. With no time left, Ethan moved toward the edge, his body shaking with fear and revulsion. He had no choice. If he stayed here, the creature would find him, and his fate would be far worse than what awaited him in the pit. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to do. His hands trembled as he lowered himself over the edge, his fingers gripping the jagged stone as he began to descend into the mass of bodies. The stench was overpowering now, making his eyes water and his stomach heave. His feet touched the soft, decaying flesh of the corpses, and he had to suppress a scream as his body sank into the mass. The sensation of the cold, clammy skin beneath him sending waves of revulsion through him. He forced himself to keep moving, climbing deeper into the pit, his hands and feet slipping on the slick, decaying bodies. The green glow grew stronger as he descended, the air becoming thicker, heavier, as if the pit itself was alive, breathing, pulsating with some dark, malevolent energy. The pit was deeper than he had expected. As he climbed down, he realized that the bodies formed only the surface layer. Beneath them, the pit stretched down into the earth, far deeper than he could have imagined. The green light intensified, casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the walls of the pit, twisting and writhing in a sickening, hypnotic pattern. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan's feet touched solid ground. The air down here was thick with the smell of rot and decay, but there was something else, a faint, metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The green glow was almost blinding now, emanating from a strange, pulsating object embedded in the stone at the bottom of the pit. It was a large, spherical stone, its surface covered in the same strange markings that adorned the walls of the chamber above. The stone pulsed with a sickly, green light, each pulse sending a wave of energy through the air, vibrating through the very ground beneath his feet. Ethan approached the stone cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got, the more he could feel the energy emanating from it, a dark, malevolent force that seemed to seep into his very soul, filling him with a sense of dread and despair. His hands trembled as he reached out to touch the stone, his fingers brushing against its cold, smooth surface. The moment his skin made contact with the stone, the ground beneath him began to shake. The pit trembled violently, the walls cracking and crumbling as the entire structure seemed to shudder under the force of some unseen power. The bodies around him shifted and slid, toppling into the pit in a grotesque avalanche of decaying flesh. The green light flared, blinding him with its intensity, and Ethan felt a searing pain shoot through his body, as if the very energy of the stone was burning him from the inside out. He staggered back, clutching his chest, his vision swimming as the pit around him collapsed, the walls caving in, the bodies tumbling into the void below. And then, from the heart of the pit, the creature emerged. It was different now, larger, more monstrous, its form shifting and twisting in the green light. Its limbs were longer, its body more grotesque, and its face was no longer featureless. It had taken on a twisted, horrific approximation of a human face, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Ethan stared in horror as the creature rose from the pit, its body towering above him, casting a long, twisted shadow that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. The ground shook beneath his feet as the creature took a step toward him, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes locked on him with a cold, malevolent gaze. There was no escape now. The creature had claimed him, and there was nowhere left to run. Chapter 10. The Dark Awakening. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears as he stumbled back, the ground shaking violently beneath him. The creature loomed before him, an abomination of twisted flesh and shadows, its eyes glinting with a cold hunger that sent a shiver coursing down his spine. He could feel the oppressive weight of its gaze, as if it were peeling back the layers of his soul, examining him, savoring the moment before the kill. He had nowhere to run. The walls of the pit were collapsing, the remnants of the bodies that had been his only cover sliding into the abyss below. With every passing second, the earth beneath him shuddered and cracked, the ground threatening to swallow him whole. The pulsing stone at the center of the pit glowed brighter, a sickly green light illuminating the horror unfolding around him. The creature took another step, its long, elongated limbs stretching impossibly as it moved, the sound of slick, squelching flesh filling the air. Ethan could see the grotesque details of its form now, scales and sinew glistening in the light, tendrils undulating like snakes around its body. It was a living nightmare, a manifestation of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the earth. Desperation flooded through him. He had to escape. Even as the creature advanced, its movements deliberate and slow, Ethan's instincts kicked in. He turned away from the pit's edge and raced toward a darkened corner of the chamber, hoping to find a passage, a tunnel, anything that might lead him away from the monstrosity pursuing him. The ground continued to quake beneath him, and the walls groaned as if in protest, but he pressed on, fueled by fear. The creature followed, moving with an unsettling grace that belied its monstrous appearance. Each step resonated through the pit, reverberating in Ethan's bones. The green glow flickered ominously, casting grotesque shadows that danced wildly against the walls. He could feel the creature's breath, cold and rancid, grazing the back of his neck like a ghostly whisper. Ethan reached the corner, fingers grazing the stone wall as he searched for an exit, any kind of salvation from the horror chasing him. The rough surface was cool against his skin, and as he explored the area, he felt a small opening, narrow and dark, barely large enough for him to squeeze through. He didn't hesitate. With a final glance back at the creature, he dove into the opening, his body sliding through the tight space as he felt the earth shift around him. He pushed forward, forcing himself deeper into the darkness. The tunnel was cramped and winding, the walls pressing in around him as he crawled through the damp earth. The air was heavy with moisture, clinging to his skin, and the stench of decay followed him like a malevolent shadow. The sound of the creature echoed behind him, a low growl reverberating through the tunnel. It was close, too close. Ethan's heart raced as he scrambled forward, his limbs aching from the exertion. The walls seemed to close in, the tunnel twisting and turning in ways that made him feel disoriented. The faint light from the pit began to fade behind him, swallowed by the suffocating darkness that enveloped him. Panic clawed at his throat as he fought to keep moving. The tunnel was like a living thing, shifting beneath him as he crawled, the earth trembling as if in response to the creature's rage. Ethan could feel it gaining on him, the air growing colder with every passing moment, the darkness pressing in around him. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a larger cavern, and Ethan gasped at the sight before him. The chamber was vast, the ceiling lost in shadows, but what drew his attention was the altar in the center, ancient and grotesque, covered in strange markings similar to those he had seen in the pit. The stone was slick with something dark, glistening like oil in the dim light. He stumbled toward the altar, searching for anything he could use, any weapon against the creature that now prowled the tunnels behind him. The air felt charged with energy, a palpable force that thrummed beneath his skin. As he reached the altar, his hands brushed against something cold and metallic, a dagger, its blade shimmering with an otherworldly light. Ethan's fingers closed around the hilt, feeling the weight of the weapon in his palm. It was unlike anything he had ever touched, pulsing with a strange energy that surged through him. It was both a comfort and a curse, the promise of power tinged with the understanding that this was not a normal blade. It was imbued with dark magic, a weapon designed for a battle against horrors that should not exist. The growl of the creature echoed through the cavern, and Ethan turned, gripping the dagger tightly as he prepared to face whatever came next. The shadows danced around him, and the air grew thick with tension. The walls seemed to vibrate with the creature's presence, the darkness coiling around him like a living entity. As the growling grew closer, Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. He would not go down without a fight. He positioned himself beside the altar, ready to strike at the first sign of movement. The creature's silhouette loomed in the entrance of the cavern, its elongated body a shadow against the faint light filtering through the tunnel. Then it stepped into the chamber, and the full horror of its form was revealed. It was larger than he had anticipated, towering over him, the sickly green light from the pit casting its grotesque features in sharp relief. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence, fixated on Ethan with a hunger that made his stomach churn. The creature paused, sniffing the air as if it could smell the fear radiating from him. Ethan tightened his grip on the dagger, feeling the cold metal against his palm, the energy pulsing from the blade almost synchronizing with his own heartbeat. He could feel the power coursing through him, an ancient force that surged in response to the creature's presence. With a sudden movement, the creature lunged, its limbs stretching out impossibly, the air thick with its rancid breath. Ethan reacted instinctively, raising the dagger and aiming for the creature's heart. The blade glinted in the dim light as he swung, adrenaline fueling his movements. The dagger met the creature's flesh, a sickening thud reverberating through the air. A burst of energy radiated from the impact, sending shockwaves through the cavern. The creature howled, a sound that pierced the air, echoing in the darkness like a banshee's wail. Its body twisted and convulsed, the grotesque features contorting in pain as Ethan pressed his advantage, driving the blade deeper. But the creature was powerful, fueled by dark magic, and it retaliated, lashing out with its long limbs. Ethan barely had time to react as one of its arms struck him, sending him crashing into the wall of the cavern. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, stars dancing in his vision as pain shot through his side. He struggled to regain his footing, the world spinning around him as he glanced back at the creature. It was reeling, but the wound he had inflicted was already healing, the flesh knitting together before his eyes. The dagger had given him a momentary advantage, but he knew it wouldn't last. Desperation clawed at his chest as he scrambled to his feet, the dagger still clutched tightly in his hand. He couldn't give up now. He had to find a way to end this. The cavern was a maze of shadows and flickering light, and he needed to outsmart the creature if he had any hope of survival. He darted toward the far side of the cavern, hoping to find another tunnel, another chance to escape. The ground beneath him trembled, the creature's growls filling the air as it regained its composure, moving with a terrifying speed toward him. Ethan's heart raced as he spotted a narrow passageway at the far end of the cavern. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward it, his feet pounding against the stone floor. The creature was close behind, its breath hot on his back, a chilling reminder of the terror that pursued him. As he reached the passageway, he threw himself into the darkness, barely avoiding the snapping jaws of the beast as it lunged for him. The tunnel was narrow, forcing him to crouch low as he crawled through the darkness, the sound of the creature's rage echoing behind him. The air was thick and stale, the walls damp and slick, and the tunnel twisted and turned, offering no sense of direction. The green glow of the creature faded into the distance as he pressed on, determined to put as much distance between them as possible. Ethan's thoughts raced. He had the dagger, but it was only a temporary solution. He needed to find a way to sever the connection between the creature and the pit, to end the darkness that had plagued him and his friends. He could still feel the energy of the stone pulsing through him, a reminder of the power it held. Perhaps it could be harnessed, used against the creature in a way that would break its hold on the darkness. The tunnel opened into yet another chamber, larger than the last, and Ethan emerged into the dim light. The air felt charged with energy, the walls shimmering with a faint glow, the markings more pronounced here than in the previous chambers. The center of the room was dominated by a large stone pedestal, similar to the altar but covered in intricate symbols that pulsed with a rhythmic light. Ethan approached the pedestal cautiously, his heart racing as he took in the strange symbols that danced across the surface. It was a map of the tunnels, a network of paths that twisted and turned beneath the earth. He traced the lines with his fingers, the energy from the markings thrumming beneath his touch. In the far corner of the chamber, he noticed a small alcove, dark and shadowy. Without a second thought, he made his way toward it, curiosity pushing him forward. As he stepped into the alcove, he felt a surge of energy, an echo of the power he had felt from the dagger. The walls were etched with runes, ancient and foreign, but the meaning was clear. A way to harness the power of the pit, to summon it and control it. He knelt, studying the runes closely, a plan forming in his mind. If he could unlock the power here, he might be able to use it against the creature, turn its own darkness against it. The air hummed with energy, and he felt an overwhelming urge to reach out and connect with the power flowing through the walls. As he concentrated, the symbols began to glow, responding to his presence. He could feel the energy swirling around him, wrapping him in a cocoon of warmth. It pulsed through him, filling him with a sense of purpose and strength. This was his chance, a moment to reclaim his fate and end the terror that had followed him. But the creature was still close, and he could sense its rage growing as it hunted him. He had to act quickly. Ethan focused on the runes, visualizing the energy he needed to summon. He could feel the connection growing stronger, the power rising within him like a tidal wave, ready to burst forth. With one final push, he released the energy, directing it toward the center of the chamber. The runes blazed to life, flooding the room with a brilliant light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The ground shook as the energy surged, the very foundation of the cavern trembling beneath him. The light erupted from the pedestal, a beam of pure energy shooting into the darkness above. It illuminated the chamber, casting away the shadows and revealing the true nature of the cave. Ethan could feel the creature's rage intensifying, its presence looming in the darkness beyond the chamber. And then he saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows, the creature's grotesque form twisting in the light. Its eyes blazed with fury, and as the energy surged, it lunged toward him, the darkness surrounding it coiling like smoke. Ethan stood firm, the energy flowing through him, wrapping around him like armor. He channeled his fear into the power, aiming it at the creature as it lunged. The two forces collided in a brilliant flash of light, the cavern erupting in a deafening roar as the darkness clashed with the light. The creature shrieked, the sound tearing through the chamber as the light engulfed it, the grotesque form twisting and writhing in pain. Ethan felt the power resonating within him, amplifying his will, and he poured every ounce of energy he had into the light, determined to break the creature's hold on the darkness. The chamber shook violently, the walls cracking and splintering as the energy surged. Ethan could feel the creature's rage, the desperation emanating from it as it fought against the light. The shadows around him writhed, clawing at the edges of the brilliance, but Ethan stood his ground. With a final surge of energy, the light erupted, filling the chamber with an explosion of brilliance that drowned out the darkness. The creature's form shattered into a million fragments, dissolving into the air as the energy consumed it, the darkness vanishing like smoke in the wind. Ethan collapsed to his knees, the energy receding, leaving him breathless and trembling. The chamber was silent now, the oppressive darkness lifted, and the remnants of the creature gone. He gazed around the chamber, the light from the pedestal flickering softly, a reminder of the power that had just been unleashed. But even as he caught his breath, a cold dread settled in his stomach. The creature was gone, but the darkness was still there, lurking just beyond the edges of his vision. The pit remained, and he could feel its pull, the malevolent energy still thrumming beneath the surface. Ethan knew that this battle was only the beginning. The darkness would not rest, and he would have to face it again. But now he had the power, the knowledge of how to harness it. As he stood, determination flooded through him. He would find a way to end this once and for all. With a newfound sense of purpose, Ethan turned back to the pedestal, studying the runes and symbols that adorned it. He would learn their secrets, unlock the mysteries of the cavern, and face whatever lay ahead. The darkness may have lost this battle, but he was ready to fight. The war was just beginning. Chapter 11. The Descent into Madness. The air felt different in the cavern as Ethan began to decipher the ancient runes. Each symbol pulsed with a low, rhythmic hum, reverberating through the stone walls and echoing in the depths of his mind. The previous battle with the creature had left him feeling raw and exposed, but with each passing moment, the glow of the pedestal began to fill him with a sense of empowerment, as if the very heart of the earth was urging him to continue. Ethan focused on the runes, tracing them with his fingertips, absorbing their meaning, as he wrestled with the knowledge that he was stepping deeper into the realm of the unknown. The very foundations of the cavern seemed to shift and tremble in anticipation, the energy flowing through him like an unending current. As he attuned himself to the vibrations in the air, he felt the weight of his responsibility press upon him. The symbols began to take shape in his mind, revealing a map of the cavernous expanse that stretched beneath the surface. It was a labyrinthine network of tunnels and chambers, each connected to the dark pit he had stumbled upon. He could see the flow of energy coursing through them, a river of malevolence that fed the creature's strength, intertwined with the ancient power he had unleashed. Ethan realized that the dagger he wielded was not merely a weapon. It was a key, a link to the very essence of the darkness. The realization sent a shiver down his spine. He was entangled in a web far more intricate than he had ever imagined. As he stood before the pedestal, the light flickering around him, he felt the pull of the pit, a siren's call urging him to delve deeper into the mysteries of the earth. The pedestal itself began to shift, the symbols glowing brighter, illuminating the cavern with an ethereal light. Suddenly, a dark fissure opened in the ground before him, a swirling vortex of shadows and light that beckoned him closer. It was both inviting and terrifying, and he felt the familiar pull of dread and curiosity battling within him. With a deep breath, he stepped closer to the fissure, drawn in by an unseen force. As he approached, the air grew colder, the shadows coiling around his ankles like tendrils of smoke. He peered into the abyss, and within its depths, he caught fleeting glimpses of what lay beneath. Faces twisted in anguish, eyes wide with terror, their silent screams echoing in his mind. They were the lost souls, the victims claimed by the darkness he had battled. The realization gripped him with a sense of urgency. He had to free them, but the darkness was relentless. It whispered promises of power and knowledge, luring him to abandon his mission and embrace the chaos. Ethan felt his resolve weaken as the voices of the lost beckoned him, urging him to join them in their eternal torment. The pull of despair threatened to overwhelm him, and he staggered back from the edge, his heart racing. The visions danced before his eyes, tormenting him with their haunting beauty and horror. They were memories of those who had come before him, warriors who had fought against the darkness but had ultimately succumbed to its seduction. He could feel their pain, their fear clawing at his heart, and he clenched his fists, trying to dispel the haunting images. He knew he had to remain strong, to find a way to break the cycle of despair that had ensnared so many. With renewed determination, Ethan turned his back to the fissure and returned to the pedestal, focusing on the light it emitted. He needed to channel the energy, to use it to illuminate the dark paths that lay ahead. As he concentrated, he envisioned the flow of energy coursing through the cavern, each symbol lighting up like a constellation. He could sense the interconnectedness of everything: the creatures, the lost souls, the darkness that permeated the earth. It was a living tapestry of anguish and power, and he was at the center, a conduit for the ancient magic that had been awakened within him. The more he focused, the more the energy surged, the glow intensifying until the cavern was bathed in light. He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against him, but he stood firm, his heart pounding with purpose. He would harness this energy to uncover the truth, to confront the source of the darkness that had taken root in this place. The markings on the pedestal began to shift, rearranging themselves into a sequence that Ethan instinctively recognized. It was a path, a journey through the darkness that would lead him deeper into the bowels of the earth. He understood now that this was not merely a descent into physical darkness, but a journey into the very heart of madness itself. With a deep breath, Ethan prepared to embark on this treacherous path. He needed to confront the entity that lay at the core of this darkness, to understand its origins, and to put an end to its influence once and for all. The energy thrummed beneath his skin, urging him onward, and he stepped forward, crossing the threshold of light into the waiting shadows. As he descended into the new tunnel, the air grew thick and heavy, each breath a reminder of the oppressive weight of despair that lingered in the air. The walls were slick with moisture, and the shadows danced around him like phantoms, whispering secrets that taunted him as he ventured deeper. It felt as if the very earth were alive, breathing in rhythm with his heart. The further he traveled, the more distorted the surroundings became. The walls shifted and warped, the ground beneath him trembling in response to the darkness that lurked just beyond his vision. He felt his mind begin to unravel, the echoes of lost souls swirling around him, their whispers a cacophony of despair and anguish. Ethan pushed forward, determined to resist the madness that threatened to envelop him. He clung to the memory of the light, the energy coursing through him, a beacon of hope in the overwhelming shadows. Each step took him deeper into the unknown, the tunnel twisting and turning in ways that defied logic, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. As he moved through the dark, he began to see flickers of movement in the shadows. Shapes coalesced and dissolved, flickering like candle flames, and he felt a growing sense of unease. The darkness was alive, and it was watching him. He could feel its gaze upon him, a weight that settled on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He reached for the dagger, its cold metal a reminder of the power he held. The blade gleamed in the dim light, a promise of protection against the darkness that sought to consume him. But as he continued deeper into the tunnel, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and he felt his grip on reality beginning to slip. Ethan stumbled, his foot catching on an unseen root that snaked across the floor, sending him sprawling to the ground. The impact jarred him, and for a moment, he lay there, disoriented, the world around him spinning. He could feel the shadows closing in, suffocating him, their whispers merging into a haunting melody that tugged at the corners of his mind. Desperately, he pushed himself to his feet, shaking off the disorientation. He had to keep moving, to stay focused on his mission. The dagger felt warm in his hand, and he drew strength from its presence, reminding himself of the purpose that had driven him thus far. He pressed onward, the tunnel narrowing as he ventured deeper into the darkness. Each step felt like a test of his will, the shadows swirling around him, taunting him with visions of despair. Faces flickered before his eyes, those who had come before him, their expressions twisted in agony. He recognized the horrors etched into their features, the pain of loss, the burden of despair, the gnawing fear of being consumed by the darkness. Ethan's heart raced as he fought against the tide of madness that threatened to engulf him. He could feel the walls closing in, the shadows pressing against him, their whispers drowning out his thoughts. It was an overwhelming cacophony, a chorus of anguish that clawed at his sanity. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the dagger, the light it emanated cutting through the dark like a beacon. Suddenly, he stumbled into a larger chamber, the air thick with a suffocating presence. The cavern was filled with an otherworldly glow, illuminating grotesque statues that lined the walls, figures frozen in eternal torment, their faces contorted in expressions of horror. The sight sent a chill coursing through him, a reminder of the fate that awaited those who succumbed to the darkness. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, similar to the one he had seen before, but far more elaborate. It was adorned with twisted remnants of the lost, their anguished faces etched into the stone, forever trapped in a tableau of despair. The altar pulsed with energy, a dark, rhythmic heartbeat that resonated in the air, drawing him closer. As he approached, he felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on him, an oppressive force that threatened to crush him beneath its weight. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more insistent, drowning out his thoughts as they clawed at the edges of his sanity. Ethan clenched his fists, the dagger's energy flaring in response to his turmoil. He reached the altar, and as he placed his hand upon its cold surface, he felt a surge of power course through him, a connection to the very essence of the darkness. It was intoxicating and terrifying, a promise of power that threatened to consume him whole. Visions flashed before his eyes, glimpses of ancient rituals, sacrifices made in the name of power, and the dark entity that lay at the heart of it all. Ethan fought to retain his focus, to resist the temptation that tugged at his mind. He understood now that this was the source of the darkness, the heart of the madness that had claimed so many before him. If he was to have any hope of defeating it, he would need to confront the very essence of this evil. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he drew the dagger from its sheath, the blade shimmering in the dim light of the altar. He held it aloft, feeling its energy resonate within him, a potent reminder of the power he possessed. The whispers shrieked in protest, the shadows recoiling from the light that emanated from the blade. Ethan closed his eyes, centering himself, envisioning the light pushing back the darkness, illuminating the chamber with its brilliance. He began to chant the incantations that had come to him through the runes, words that resonated with the energy of the earth itself. Each syllable flowed from his lips like a river, carrying with it the weight of his determination. As the energy surged, he felt the shadows writhe around him, their forms twisting and contorting in agony as the light pressed against them. The whispers grew frantic, a cacophony of fear and rage that threatened to overwhelm him. But Ethan stood firm, anchoring himself to the light that filled him, allowing it to flow through him, amplifying his resolve. Suddenly, the chamber shook violently, the ground trembling beneath his feet. The shadows recoiled, retreating from the light, but Ethan felt the darkness pushing back, a desperate attempt to reclaim its hold. He could sense the dark entity lurking just beyond the veil, its presence palpable, and he knew he was on the brink of a confrontation that would determine his fate. With a final surge of energy, he released the light from the dagger, unleashing it into the chamber in a blinding wave of brilliance. The shadows erupted, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the light engulfed the altar. For a fleeting moment, he felt a sense of euphoria wash over him, a connection to the very heart of the earth as the energy surged through him. But then, the ground split open beneath him, and he was consumed by the darkness, swallowed whole by the void. The light flickered, struggling to hold back the encroaching shadows as he fell deeper into the abyss. His heart raced, fear gripping him as he plummeted into the depths of madness, the whispers swirling around him, clawing at his mind. Ethan fought against the tide, refusing to succumb to the despair that sought to claim him. He would not let the darkness win. He would rise again, stronger than before, fueled by the knowledge that he held the key to defeating the entity that had haunted him for so long. With a final surge of will, he grasped the dagger tightly, ready to face whatever lay ahead in this battle between light and darkness. Chapter 12. The Reckoning. Ethan fell into a void, surrounded by a silence so profound it felt like the absence of existence itself. The sensation of weightlessness enveloped him, and for a moment, he lost all sense of direction, time dissolving into nothingness. Shadows slithered around him, caressing his skin with icy fingers, but he was not afraid. The darkness had become an adversary he understood, a force he had learned to confront. The abyss began to shift, rippling like water disturbed by a pebble. Gradually, the shadows coalesced, forming shapes that danced just beyond the edges of his vision. Memories flickered within the darkness, fragments of anguish, faces twisted in despair, the whispers of lost souls echoing through the void. Ethan felt their pain as a tangible weight pressing down on him, a reminder of the stakes at play. He could see them now, the victims caught in the web of the darkness, their forms shifting like smoke. They reached out with desperate hands, their mouths moving in silent cries, imploring him for release. Ethan's heart ached at the sight, but he knew he could not falter. This was the reckoning, the moment to confront the entity that had claimed them, to face the source of the darkness that threatened to consume everything. As he steadied himself, a pulsing light began to emanate from the dagger, casting a warm glow in the oppressive void. The darkness recoiled, hissing in discontent, but Ethan grasped the dagger firmly, channeling his determination into the blade. With each pulse of light, he felt the energy flowing through him, a connection to the very essence of the earth itself. Suddenly, the shadows twisted violently, morphing into a grotesque figure that loomed before him. It was a manifestation of the darkness, an entity forged from the nightmares of the lost souls it had devoured. Its form was ever-shifting, a swirling mass of tendrils and eyes that glimmered with malice, hungry and relentless. The air around them thickened with a palpable tension, and Ethan could feel the malevolent energy radiating from it. In that moment, the abyss erupted into chaos, the darkness swirling violently as the entity advanced. Ethan stood his ground, heart pounding, but he refused to yield. He raised the dagger high, the light illuminating the darkness, pushing back against the encroaching shadows. The entity recoiled, its form writhing as it fought against the brilliance of the blade. With every ounce of will, Ethan unleashed the energy coursing through him, directing it toward the creature. The light surged forth, engulfing the darkness, illuminating the abyss with a blinding radiance. The entity shrieked, a sound that echoed through the void like the howling winds of a storm, and Ethan could feel its rage vibrating through the air. He could see the tendrils of darkness shriveling under the intensity of the light, the entity thrashing in an attempt to escape the onslaught. But Ethan pressed on, pouring every ounce of his strength into the dagger, the light radiating outward in brilliant waves. He felt the connection with the lost souls intensifying, their anguish mingling with his determination. The shadows writhed around him, but Ethan stood firm, heart racing as he channeled the memories of those who had been lost. Each face flashed before his eyes, victims of the darkness that had preyed upon their fears and desires. They were with him now, their strength merging with his, fueling his resolve. As the light enveloped the entity, Ethan could sense its essence, twisted and dark, a being forged from despair and madness. It was a reflection of every fear he had ever harbored, a manifestation of the darkness that lurked within every soul. He understood now that this battle was not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered in silence, trapped within the clutches of despair. With renewed vigor, he pressed forward, the dagger gleaming like a beacon in the suffocating darkness. The light surged, illuminating the chamber around them, revealing the remnants of lost souls entwined in chains, their eyes wide with terror. They were the guardians of the darkness, caught in a cycle of torment, and Ethan felt their cries echoing within him. The entity writhed and screamed, but Ethan refused to falter. He focused on the light, letting it pour from the dagger in a dazzling display of power. The shadows fought back, but they were no match for the brilliance that surged within him. The very fabric of the void began to tear, light piercing through the darkness like a dawn breaking over the horizon. Ethan's heart raced as he pushed through the overwhelming waves of despair, feeling the light pulsing within him, transforming into a weapon against the darkness. He could feel the essence of the entity beginning to unravel, the tendrils of shadow dissipating like smoke caught in a gust of wind. With each strike of light, the entity screamed, its form fracturing and fading into nothingness. In that moment of chaos, a flash of clarity struck him. The darkness thrived on fear, on the despair that clung to the souls it had consumed. He understood that to defeat it, he needed to embrace the light fully, to allow it to shine through every doubt and fear within himself. He had to confront his own darkness, the shadows that whispered doubt in the corners of his mind. With a fierce determination, Ethan took a deep breath and let the light fill him completely, transcending the darkness that had plagued him for so long. He visualized every fear, every moment of weakness, allowing the light to wash over them, transforming them into strength. The dagger glowed brighter than ever, a symbol of hope against the encroaching despair. The entity howled, its form cracking under the intensity of the light, and Ethan felt a surge of power coursing through him. He pressed forward, the dagger blazing with brilliance, unleashing the light like a torrent. The shadows screamed, their cries echoing through the void as they were torn apart, fading into nothingness. As the darkness unraveled, Ethan felt the weight of the lost souls lifting, their anguished forms breaking free from their chains. They shimmered in the light, faces turning toward him, eyes filled with gratitude and relief. In that moment, he knew he had reclaimed not just his own light, but theirs as well. The void erupted into a dazzling spectacle, the darkness giving way to a brilliant cascade of colors, swirling and illuminating the abyss. The entity shrieked one last time, its form dissolving into a mist that scattered like autumn leaves in the wind. The air grew still, and Ethan stood amid the remnants of the darkness, heart pounding with exhilaration. The chamber began to shift around him, the oppressive weight of despair lifting as the light filled the space. He felt a connection to the lost souls, their gratitude wrapping around him like a warm embrace. In that moment, he understood that he had not only faced the darkness but had transformed it into something beautiful, a testament to resilience and strength. As the last remnants of the darkness faded, Ethan took a deep breath, savoring the stillness that enveloped him. He gazed around the chamber, which now pulsed with life, vibrant colors illuminating the once dark stone. The air felt lighter, and he could sense the energy of the earth flowing through him, a reminder of the battles fought and won. With the dagger still glowing brightly in his hand, Ethan turned toward the path that lay ahead, the way now illuminated by the radiant light. He knew there would be more challenges to face, but he felt an unwavering resolve within him. The darkness had been vanquished, but its remnants would linger, and he would stand ready to confront them. As he stepped forward, the cavern transformed, the path ahead winding into a landscape of light and shadow, both coexisting in harmony. He had discovered the truth, that darkness and light were intertwined, each feeding into the other, a delicate balance that defined existence itself. Ethan moved forward, guided by the light within him, a symbol of hope against the shadows that lay beyond. He was no longer merely a traveler in this world. He was a guardian of the light, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with courage and determination. The abyss had become a realm of possibility, and he would forge a new path, illuminating the way for those who had lost their way in the darkness. With each step he took, Ethan embraced his journey, knowing that the true battle against darkness would always be within. But now, armed with the light of hope and the strength of the lost souls, he was ready to carry their legacy forward, illuminating the shadows and creating a brighter world for all.